Hey everybody, welcome. So we're going to go into 15 minutes in this sort of mini lecture. So we're going to cover the Gilded Age origins and the Transcontinental Railroad. So this is an interesting period from 1870 to 1900, where we see technology really starts to explode. The railroad industry starts to really take off. There's more money and innovation as a result of it. But these early corporations, particularly in the railroad industry, bring about massive business. We already learned a bit about Cornelius Vanderbilt, but we're going to look into guys like George Pullman and some other major movers and shakers. So we see these terms like trusts. Trusts were early businesses, and the heads of these sort of trusts or these corporations were robber barons or captains of industry, depending on how you view them, what side of the argument you might be on. You see, if you were, the leaders, the movers and shakers, you might be a captain of industry. Someone to really look up to, and therefore a philanthropist. You made $1 million or so, you make a huge pile of money, but you give back to society. You build libraries, universities, schools. This is something we're going to see more with Andrew Carnegie in The Gospel of Wealth in another lesson. Or you might be a robber baron, someone who doesn't really give all that much back. They're seen as an individual who exploits the workers, who basically help them build their wealth. They kind of take advantage about them. But there's more that we're going to discuss on that throughout this whole entire unit. So as a result, workers will begin to sort of unionize. They're going to collectively bargain, they're going to get together, and they're going to try and fight back. And we're going to see an example of this with farmers in the railroad industry as well. So where does the Gilded Age get its term from? It comes from two authors, one of which quite famous, Mark Twain. He's one of the best satirists of his generation. He basically looks around and he looks at the absurdity of society. So he and Charles Dudley Warner write this book in 1873 called The Gilded Age. And it's basically just, to describe this era, an era where everything seems golden. There's a lot of wealth being thrown around. Society is changing drastically. There's a lot of new technology and innovations that are brought about. But if you look a little bit closer, it's easy to get caught up in the wealth of the captains of industry or robber barons, depending on how you look at them. And you see how they change society. But there's a lot of corruption. And if you just scratch off that golden veneer, if you peel back the curtain, you'll see a lot of rot, corrosion, corruption. It's this idea that something that appears golden and beautiful is really rotten, cheap, and worthless on the inside. So the Transcontinental Railroad is a fairly good description of, the Gilded Age in itself. There's two prominent rail industries, rail businesses, these trusts. We have the Union Pacific Railroad and the Central Pacific. They kind of compete against one another, but ultimately they come together and they connect their respective lines at Promontory, Utah. This is done in 1869 on May 10th. And it's symbolized by a golden spike being driven into the ground, connecting the last major rail. So this is sort of the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. And by 1890, about 180,000 miles of rail cross the United States from the East Coast to the West Coast. And if you want to think about it, after the Civil War, this is kind of like sutures. This is a surgeon kind of connecting the North and the South, the divide, by sort of stitching up this divide between the nation. So they're no longer connected by North and South. Now we're connected East and West. So there are some effects of the Transcontinental Railroad. It brings about a lot of adventure and fresh starts for a lot of people, particularly for the new immigrants that we're going to be talking about, particularly the Chinese and the Irish. But you see, harsh life is going to exist for the Chinese and the Irish immigrants. I mean, the Chinese are escaping a rebellion, known as the Boxer Rebellion, and those who rebelled, a lot like the Confederates in the Civil War. They need to move on. They need to find new opportunities and new land. So this is kind of a fresh start over. And for the Irish who are escaping, famine back home, This is another opportunity for unskilled laborers in particular to find a new job, to make $1 a day, which is not bad money at this time. It's not bad money at all. But it's also a new opportunity for Civil War veterans. This is the first time where we're going to see ex-Union soldiers and ex-Confederate soldiers working side by side. And not just them. You'll also find, you're going to find ex-slaves who refuse to stay back in the failed attempts of Reconstruction in the South and take up jobs as sharecroppers to be exploited under a new system of slavery. Instead, they're going to work side by side with ex-Confederate soldiers and Union soldiers, Chinese and Irish immigrants, to sort of forge a new life, to find a new opportunity. But this in turn, as I mentioned, brings about some harsh realities. So, as an example, you start to see a lot of dangers, particularly Native American attacks. As the rail lines go further and further west, they get farther removed from the East Coast. They make their way into the Great Plains. We're pushing into places like Wyoming, Colorado. You push eventually into California. Various native groups, particularly the Great Plains Indians, groups like the Lakota Sioux, they would launch raids and attacks on these sort of workers' camps. And if you were a Chinese immigrant, or you were, an ex-Confederate soldier, you were liable to be a target. And you could be shot at in these raids with either bows and arrows or even just firearms. And if you were injured and you were trying to crawl desperately away, one Native American warrior might come along and scalp you. They basically remove the top portion of your head, clean shave, exposing that skull with a tomahawk or a scalping knife. And the hopes is that you don't die. In fact, they hope that you live to tell the tale. And you spread these fearful tales to your camp as a means to sort of get these guys to quit, to move on, to stop pressing further into the West, into what is seen as increasingly hostile native territory. But if you were in mountainous terrain, if you were building a rail line in a mountain, when the winter hits, you might be susceptible to, well, obviously these cold temperatures. You could freeze to death, but even avalanches. And you could be completely covered and swept away, just buried. And so, as a result, there's a lot of accidents that exist on the rail line. This is all built by hand. So there are a lot of deaths, there's a lot of injuries, disease is common as the conditions in these workers' camps are less than ideal. There's a lot of stress you can imagine, wondering, when is the next winter going to hit, when it's going to get cold. It could rain really bad on you. There could be, Native American raids on your camp. They're not the best of times. So there are some unique effects from the Transcontinental Railroad. It's not all terrible. Time zones are created, for one. So now that I need to ship my oil from Cleveland, Ohio to, say, Albany, New York, this is something that we're going to see with John D. Rockefeller trying to ship his goods to Cornelius Vanderbilt. I need to know when. When am I going to receive this product that I've purchased from your company? So now that we have time zones, we can more accurately, detail when goods will arrive and ship, especially because we know how roughly fast the locomotives go. 15, 20 miles per hour. We can calculate that. So this brings in growth. Every industry is attached to the railroad industry. Glass is going to explode. Steel, in particular, with Andrew Carnegie. Iron will eventually replace the wooden lumber, the wooden planks that were initially used primarily from trees here in Michigan to build the rail lines. Coal is now really sought after to help fuel the engines of the locomotives to transport goods. And as a result, workers' camps no longer become just camps. Now they become towns. These guys don't move away. This is a new opportunity to sort of set up shop. I have money, I have work, and so this is an opportunity to specialize in other areas outside of the rail line. And so we start to see towns trading between one another. And we also see some towns becoming cities, and these towns and cities having areas of specialization. You know, this town might be known for brewing beer. That town might be known for a good place to party it up in the tavern or casino over the weekend. One town might discover a mine nearby, and now they start to mine for iron or for coal. And so this is just a map of the time zones that get set up. You can see right here in Michigan, Detroit, we're in the Eastern time zone. So this brings us to captain of industry, or a robber baron, depending on how you view him. Someone who either gives back to society or doesn't. You know, I'll leave it up to you to decide. So George Pullman, he's a railroad car mogul. That basically means he is a real mover and shaker in this industry. He's an innovator. And he starts his company to build railroad sleeper cars, which is a big deal. You know, the Pullman rail line industry. You know, when the railroads first started and you were trying to, you know, you could be transported anywhere, you know, for say 5 to 10 cents. There was, you know, no roof on these initial locomotives. So like all the ash and the soot from the smokestack would blow into your eyes. And there were no seat belts. You know, you just had a wooden bench that you basically sat on, and as the train is sort of you know, jerking and moving forward and lurching whenever it starts or stops, you could just get, you know, flung right from your seat. So you had to have a death grip on this bench. So he sees a real need for comfort and travel. And especially if you're trying to get from like the East Coast in New York all the way to say California, you're going to be traveling for a long time going 15, 20 miles per hour. So you should travel in style, in comfort. So this is an opportunity for him to exploit. This is a chance for people to move into these new specialized towns and cities with nice apartments, windows. You know, the glass industry takes off because of this. Windows start to be used for the locomotive cars. And they're going to provide all kinds of services. You can get 3-course meal. You know, you could sleep in these cars overnight. You have your own private room. But there were some strict rules. You couldn't really just hang out or loiter around, and generally speaking, there was supposedly no alcohol allowed. They didn't want, you know, people getting too rowdy on the trains. The goal here for guys like George Pullman was to create and stabilize a workforce. If you can control them and their behaviors, you can control their profits. So we see this becoming a big issue, actually, because there's going to be a pay decrease that ultimately results, but rent won't decrease. And this in turn will lead to violent strikes in 1894, what becomes known as the Pullman strikes. See, as a result, guys like George Pullman create these things called Pullman towns, right? You're my employee. So we have this quote from a worker, actually. We are born in a Pullman house, fed from the Pullman shops, we're taught in the Pullman school, catechized in the Pullman church. Basically, you know, you're preached to in the church. And when we die, we shall go to the Pullman hell. Whoa. Guys like George Pullman owned everything. These old camps along the rail lines became towns. And who do you think owns the land? For every mile that you could build on the rail line in a railroad company as an owner, the government gave you 640 acres of land. It's a lot of territory. So now my employees live on my land. So I charge them rent. They got to pay me. So everything they do, I pay them to do the work, and they in turn pay that money back to me just to live. So you start to see workers, particularly farmers, as the rail lines start to encroach on their land, fight back. They form a union known as the Grange, and they will just take shots at rail lines and locomotives that are coming past their territory. No one ever gets killed, really. But the government has to basically step in. So they create the Interstate Commerce Act to regulate the railroad industry, to reduce excessive railroad rates, and to basically support farmers' rights in their lands. but it's not very effective, not until 1906 really.